Okay, so next episode today in early January. So we went basically over the introduction of HTML. I know that it can be a little bit confusing, and I know that there was a lot of like additional work that needs to be done until you feel comfortable with it. But nonetheless, today we are moving to 3.2, which is CSS, and that's basically what we want to look at today. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. You probably read a lot about CSS3, as that is basically the version that we're currently working with. There are a couple of advanced technologies, if you want, so or methods that basically were introduced with CSS3, which basically historically came a little bit at the same time as HTML5. So that introduced new capabilities and is basically not too relevant for our introduction, because the basics that we're going to talk about are not too different from how CSS2, for example, worked. Maybe with the exception of variables, but we'll get to that in a second. So let's basically see what we want to cover today. So styling with HTML. So we're going to jump back into HTML and see how we basically start styling these things. By doing so, we're going to talk about basic principles, and we're going to end this whole thing with famous CSS frameworks and a little bit of just my opinion and bits on those, and what are good for what kind of reason and or use cases. So that is basically where we're going to begin today. So what we will see here is we remember this from the last time I whipped up a very simple HTML page, and this is the output that we're looking at basically. So this is basically the stuff I want to go through. So you can see I basically placed, let's go back to the body, you remember this. So I have a container, so I call this class container, and then I have a headline h1 with what basically says headline, then there's an introduction text, and then we have a bullet list of basically the stuff we want to talk about. So inline style tag and linked is basically the first principle that we want to talk about. So what do people mean by inline styles? That's actually pretty simple. I can apply a style attribute to any given element and basically define my styles there. So as an example, I'm going to use this introduction text here and give this a style attribute, and in the style attribute I can write my CSS, right? So let's, for example, say like I want to say this has the color blue. Oops. Color blue. You don't have to worry about like the format as of now, but just so you see, this is what people refer to as inline style. So I directly write into this into this element with the style attribute. So then there's the style tag. The style tag is basically like any other tag. So I have style with a huge difference, and this is a little bit like script, with a huge difference that in here now there's no HTML in here, there's CSS in here. So let's, for example, say the container. Also at this point you don't have to understand this, but so I'm going to target now the container and basically say let's make all of this blue. And the result would basically then be everything is blue. So that would be in the style tag. And the most common form for separation principles, and simply because it makes the most sense, is to include a style sheet file. That's exactly what we're going to do. So I'm going to create this. I'm just going to say new style sheet and do the CSS and just call it style. So now I have a style CSS. So let's simply move this over here and get rid of all of this and all of this. Okay, so if I now load this page, and you will basically see this is one of the meta attributes that we need to set. So in the head, what I want to do is I basically want to say I have a style sheet, and I give the path either relative or absolute to this style CSS. So what happens now is that you can see everything is blue. So this loads the style sheet from this separate file and applies it accordingly. So that is basically it, what makes it easy for us, because what we now know is, okay, so what we really want to see is we're going to look at our, and this is actually, we almost don't need this. Actually, we don't need this. We're going to look at our style down here, and we can here see basically how it is applied. So the next thing that we want to talk about is selectors. So there's a lot to be said about CSS selectors. We're going to go over, the most important things, that is tag, ID, class, nested, and pseudo. That's basically something that we just need to get over with. So the first thing how we can select particular elements is by tag. So if I, for example, would say I want to write to everything concerning body, I can simply write body. So whenever you write CSS files, you have the selector, and the applied styles are basically within these curly brackets. And every line, when I say like, okay, so this basically looks a little bit like a JSON, if that's something you're familiar with. So I can basically say what is the attribute I'm going to target, and then what is the value of that. So in the body, I could, for example, let's just stick to the easy thing here, and could now say color red. So what would happen now is that every body element that is found, which of course in an HTML document is only one, you can now basically say, okay, everything in this body has this style applied to it. And just for debugging purposes, next thing that we're going to look at is basically so depending on what you're using, like I'm using Firefox now, but I mean Chrome is also a good solution. You can basically see, okay, on the body there is a applied style, and I can basically in this tool make changes accordingly. So that's basically the general setup. So again, you have here the selector, and then you basically say, okay, here is the list of applied styles, and then you say, okay, what's what's basically the rule I want to talk about, and what value does it have. So I can of course have multiple rules that apply. So I can also now say font family is, let's just take something weird, doesn't matter, and it probably wants to have a, you know what, we should take something easier probably. Let's do that. It's actually one of them. Font size, oops, what does it do here? Okay. So as you can see now, it basically changed this. So it's applied both of those. You can now see in, why can't you see that? And that both the color and the font size are applied styles. And again, you can see that in that we have this simple thing like, okay, what? So in that case, color, and then the value, same here, what, and then the color. So needless to say, we will not be able to go through a lot of, well, what possible things can I basically target here. What we can do is to provide you like with the basic logic of, okay, how do I understand what is happening, and how do I Google for certain things. So when you think about something like, let's just add something like background. Start with a little bit of principles. So if I give this a different color now and say, okay, it's a CC. Let's make this clean. And then you can see the background color changed. So there are a little bit of logic, at least, that you can apply that would help you to Google the right kind of things. So first of all, if you look at values, then you can basically see here I've written red, but there are multiple ways to interpret color for your browser. So here you basically see I used a hex notation of the particular value. And alternatively, what I could also do is, for example, do this. Oops. So RGB, red, green, blue. So let's say I want to have 25 of that, and 30 of that, and 50 of that. And that would give me this color here. So this is basically relatively simple. If you have no idea about how colors are basically generated, so you would have a red value between 0 and 255, same for green and same for blue, and this is how colors get mixed. Now there are millions of tools that will help you with that. Needless to say, your browsers, my IDE here is pretty easy to operate here, and I can basically see here what kind of value is it. This will be the hex value accordingly. I can change all kinds of things. I can add an alpha channel to it, and then account for transparency. So let's just say that's 0.7. So as you can see, okay, now it looks still solid, of course, because there's nothing behind it. But it basically now added and we can basically see that also here, the opacity, and this is now a transparent coloring that we have. So the principle is basically you have either the possibility to write names. There's of course a list of such names, and that is pretty extensive. Like you can, you have stuff like your thing will help you, and this always has an equivalent in RGB and in hex, of course. Most of the time, those kind of things will be supplied for you by a designer, but whatever. If you want to play around with it yourself, that's fine. Most graphical tools, whether it be GIMP or Photoshop and so on, will give you those values. Most web pages, or basically what I can do here, is, of course, I can also just grab those values with a variation of tools and see, okay, this is, for example, what red would be. See, so I have that copied. So instead of here saying red, I can also do this. That wouldn't change, of course, it's still the same color. But as you can see, this translates accordingly. Now, you don't need to know this, but you might notice that if you look here, for example, what's actually happening. So those are also 6 values, right? So like our RGB is basically what's happening here as well. So this would be red, so that will be full red, and then no, so 0, 0, there's no green and no blue. So it's a pure red that we're seeing here. Let's actually get rid of the background. Oh, no, let's not get rid of the background. So that's basically how colors operate. Same thing with sizes. You have a couple of things. So here I chose pixel, which basically means that's simply a absolute value in pixel. You can see that, but there are all kinds of different measurements you can basically use to work with different sizes and percentages and so on. So I can, of course, also say something like this, right? And then it just gets tricky because you have to consider in what relation that will happen. But that's unfortunately something that we can't get into. So that is basically how things work. So a little bit of how those things are comprised. So here you can see basically there is font. If I start typing font, and you will see that, then so there is always a general notation, so that would be font, and then a more precise possibility to adjust that. Why is that? Well, for example, this background. Let's go into background, for example. So I gave this a color. So in reality, what this is doing is it applies background color. Right? So this would be, for now, exactly the same. And I should probably... But yeah, this is, you can't comment out, you need to comment it out like this. So this will be basically the same as here, but if we apply something like, let's say background, let's do this. Okay, so background repeat would basically be, if you imagine like I have a tile and I want this to be repeated, or I want to prevent to be repeated. In that case, this really doesn't make any sense, but let's just assume that those are two rules I want to apply now. So this, again, will not do anything for us visually. But what you have to understand is that those hyphens and then the specification is something that you always can, there's always a relation to this. So I could also simply write this like that, and then get rid of those two, and you can see it will still be the same, and the no repeat can be also written in one line with the main attribute, which is just background. But of course you can imagine that this gets a little bit either long or complex depending on what kind of stuff you need to account for. But this is basically how you can handle yourself through finding particular things when you're looking for specific functionality. So as I said before in the other videos, this is all about your Google foo. There is an endless list of CSS selectors and functions and you name it that no introduction will be able to provide to you. And it also doesn't make sense to basically pick and choose, okay, what is the kind of vocabulary that you should start with. What does make sense is that you start developing something, and as soon as you hit a problem, you know what to look for, so you can basically grow with your project and immediately jump into something that has an output, which is kind of the reason why we have this introduction here in the first place. Good. So this is basically the tag selector. Let's jump into our actual task here. Then we have different kinds of selectors. So for an ID, we don't have an ID in here. As I said in the last one, you can only have an ID is unique to a particular element. So let's give this an ID and just call this list for now. So the selector for an ID is a hashtag, and as you can see, I already got this recommendation here. And so what happens, and actually let me get rid of this because this is a little bit confusing. Let's have this nice and clean again. And now I can basically select things based on the ID. Now, when we're going to get into JavaScript, we will notice that the ID is something that is very suboptimal for usage in CSS. Normally, IDs are generated anyway; they're dynamic, so you really hardly write that. But that's a very different story. And there's only one reason why people like to use it, is because, so let's say we have topics. Right, so if I say I have another topics, and here is some text. Then if I choose by class, which is the most common way to choose something, right? So topic, and say, okay, let's just say color green. Then I have, of course, the issue that both of those are applied. So it works here and it works here. And so the beginner sometimes has this problem that the assumption is made that, well, you need to select something that is unique. But we will get to it later that this kind of setup doesn't make any kind of sense. and that you want a class to be applied to multiple cases. You just want to be more specific or add a second class. So let's just say here, let's say topics in reality just defines the font family, let's say. Font family, and take us a section here. So this is, and then, sure. Noto, oops. Noto mono, or even better. Even better. Need to, oh, come on. Do this the other way around. Okay. Okay, so now we apply a particular style, a particular font family to those two. So I'm going to use this basically into instances, but only this one I want to be green. So what I would normally do here is I have something logical that makes sense to me, and for example, say something like text green, and then say, oops, color green. And then here, additionally, I apply text green. So now I've achieved exactly what I wanted to do. So both of those are intended to have this font family, but only this is intended to have green text. And at this point, I introduced something also that you should consider. So how you name your classes should be very logical to you. Right? Topics is, for example, non-speaking list is an absolute no-go. But this is basically the first one where we say, like, okay, this makes sense in the long run because it's easy to remember and I can apply this. And I could, for example, create something like text blue and then say color blue. Right? And it would basically act accordingly. So at this point, what we could also do, this is a little bit of a side note, I mean, we're still here, but what we could also do is basically look into, well, how would it react if I apply both? So if I apply text green and text blue, what you will see is that this gets overwritten. So while this style applies, the text green, this rule is written after that, which basically means now it applies. And so while it was declared green, now it's overwritten to blue, and that's why you see it's blue. Now, to understand, how this basically works, I have the first quiz question for you. So what do you think? If I change the order here, will it now change or not? Okay, let's see. It is still blue. So even though we apply the text green after the text blue, it is still blue. So why is that? Well, as you can see, classes, that's just one string. So if I want to basically have a control over in which order something gets executed, it needs to be formulated like that in the style sheet itself. So if I were to change it here, then you can see now it's green, because this rule applies first. So it's red top to bottom. This rule applies first, and then this rule applies, which basically means now that it has two, then that this rule is basically overriding what was set in this rule. Now I have a little bit of control over preventing that. I can do important, and when that happens, certain things are basically locked in and allow me to overwrite things from a priority standpoint. At the same time, this is not a recommendation. Like, you should probably only do that if you can find a different solution. Basically, when I see a lot of importance in CSS codes, I can already tell you it's a structural problem rather than a logical decision. Okay. So that said, we now know how to select classes And what we can also do is we can nest and combine selectors accordingly. So let's try this out. So first of all, let's keep this blue. So what I can do is I have a couple of possibilities. So I can first of all can combine it. So for example, I could say, okay, but if text blue and topics applies, then I don't know, let's say font size to rem, and I can see then this would be true because this div actually has both classes available. The only thing you got to be really careful here is this matters. So if I put a space in here, you will notice that it does not apply, because if I do a space in here, then it assumes it is nested. So let's do this the other way around. And for example, say, okay, I want to have this applies if I'm in topics in the selector list, right? So now it works because it basically says like, okay, if there are topics, right, we find this, and then there's an element under topics, right? So a nested element, and in that case that has the ID list, then that works. Now this gets a little bit in this case it's directly under it, but this would apply for everything that is below topics. So if I had it here, it would work as well. And you can prevent that. And there are a couple of things that you know are kind of too far now, but I mean you have possibilities to you know select a particular child, or it has to be a direct selector down. So if only if it's the direct descendant and so on. So there are a couple of things. So when you start seeing you know all kinds of operators that you're not familiar with, just Google that, and you will see that you have a lot of possibilities to do that. However, CSS selectors are relatively expensive when it comes to performance. So if you see rules that basically do stuff like, I don't know, right, when it says like, okay, body, div, I don't know, topics, right? So let's just do this instead. Right? So this would still work, of course, because it says, okay, from the body, you know, go find me the div that's directly below it. Got it. If there is then topics, yep, got it. You know, then we could actually do this even worse and say ul, right? And you would see it would still apply. So and then you know like directly under there a bullet list, then apply the style. But this is relatively high performance for you know for your rendering process for your browser. So this if you write styles like this, it will be relatively slow. It's naturally important to understand this, and sometimes you will have to generate stuff like this. But you should try to avoid like the kind of deep selectors if you can. So the last thing that we want to talk about is the pseudo selectors. Now we could also now basically say, okay, so for example on hover, okay, now this will behave like really strange, don't well, bear with me. So this would basically say, okay, when this selected element hovers, so the mouse is above it, and as you can see, as soon as the mouse is above it, this happens, and this rule all of a sudden applies. See that? There are all kinds of pseudo elements that you know we can talk about. I mean, hover is probably the most common one, but there are also things that you would feel a little bit different. So I could, for example, do stuff like after, and what happens then is, let's just say content, and then we do something like, I don't know, it's just height. That shows it, I think. That shows it, I think. Yep. Okay. So if we now basically go in here, no, where's RUL? Inspect element, you will see that there's a different, and I don't know why this height isn't applied. This does not work. Oops. That's kind of interesting. Oh, it's because it's in the UL. Okay, got it. Let's put it here. It's still not. Okay. So we can at least see it. Okay. So what you can now basically see is, and you can see that 2 times, right, is that we have these little things here. So those are not really elements, but they exist as complete pseudo elements. See that? And this is sometimes used, you know, to work with elements. Those are basically also CSS hacks that you will find a lot. Where, for example, something needs to be cleared, you know, like if something floats and or you know, some padding needs to be reset, you know, all that kind of stuff, you will basically find in these kind of pseudo elements. And that concludes the most important things. You will basically also find attribute selectors. But let's actually, that's a little bit too much, I suppose. Let me see what else I wanted to go through. That is not it. That is not it. No. Okay, went through that. Okay, I kind of derailed from my plan, but that's fine. That's fine. Shouldn't be a problem. So let's talk about the next one, and that is media queries. So media queries are basically something that you will find with a lot of frameworks, that it does say things like mobile first approach. So how is this in reality done? Is for example, let's do something that is actually logical and would actually happen in real life. So what would happen in real life is that we would, for example, have something like a container, right? So you can see that is basically the class of this, and we would then basically say, let's say width is let's say 900 pixel, and then we're going to say margin 0 auto, right? So now what we would find here, where's my container? Oh, this is actually, I need to make this way smaller to make this to make this a showcase here. This is a really strange amount of container size, but let's just assume so we can basically see this here in one screen. So this would basically now apply to the container. Okay, this container has a width of 300, right? That's how wide it is, and a margin, which basically means a margin is the distance it has. In that case, it starts with the y-axis, so top bottom, and then here auto. So this places it in the middle. So this the distance here and the distance here is basically auto calculated, and we didn't give it any kind of distance, you know, to the top or the bottom. So as you can imagine, there are instances where you say like, okay, this doesn't really work out for all kinds of devices, right? So normally you would have to go and have like a little bit of devices that you would basically work this with. So it's very unrealistic to have this as a certain amount of pixel, because you want to account for all kinds of devices. So what they mean when they say mobile first approach is, okay, this, for example, would not exist. And we would basically say, okay, this is the default state on a mobile device, right? So if you say, actually, we can even trigger this and test it out and say, okay, this is how it would look like on a mobile device. However, and this is basically what media queries are for, I can start defining. So, and this would be written with @media, and then actually all is enough, but let's do this nice on the screen, and I'm gonna say min width is let's say 400 pixel. So what I have now, I'm constructing basically a rule. So screen, this is basically because you could have a print version and all kinds of things. So this is what we basically write. And so this is how we concatenate rules. The minimum width of that screen is 400 pixel, right? So now we have created basically a subset of that rule. And now we can say, okay, then with the container rule, then apply your width of 300. Okay, so what does this do? So here nothing changes, of course. I have a total width of 320 here. So this rule would not apply. So as soon as I open this up, though, this rule all of a sudden applies, because now what we have here, actually, this is even nicer to show you here. You can basically see when that happens. So here I can basically change this up. So, and as soon as we hit 400, I don't even know why I don't see the changes here, but that's very interesting. Okay, I need to click out of it. Interesting. Okay, then let's do 399. So here it's still not limited to 300. As you can see, it goes out. It uses the full width that is available on the screen. And as soon as I hit 400, you will see now the container rule of 300 max applies. See that? Now it changed. So what we do that because, okay, so now we assume that we're in a screen wide enough that we don't just want to have it from edge to edge. And that's basically the principle that you will find all over the place with like all the frameworks and so on. So you can start playing around with this, and as you can see in that, all the logical rules apply again. So in there I can just basically apply this a subset of my CSS if you want. So that is I mean already everything. So here you can also, of course, you can apply the other way around if you wanted to. The reason why I chose min width is because, again, the mobile first approach is normally what you do. So you write your rules assuming that you're on a small device, on a mobile device, and then you basically go from there and say, okay, what happens if the screen size gets bigger, and then I get an iPad and so on. And logical steps for this are also quite well documented, and they're very logical default values that you can use in order to determine that. But again, most frameworks have a setup that is already quite nicely set up for that. So the animation and variables. With CSS variables, well, yes, that's maybe, let's start with animation. So an animation is basically something that you will find a lot, because it's more or less like the home of CSS, like all the stuff that you want to do with it. So we could, for example, say we want now those two definitions that we had of the blue and green, we want basically that to fluctuate based on a particular logic. So the first thing that we want to define is to say, okay, so let's basically say we have keyframes, and we're gonna call this colorful. We're going to call this colorful, And so what it does is basically to say, okay, I define here, make this simple for now, from, and then I say color blue to color green. This is going to be super ugly, but it's going to get the point over. This actually needs to be in here. Now, what we have to find now is basically the colorful can go from color blue to color green. And how do we apply this? Well, relatively simple. So here where we have text blue and so on and so on and so on, let's instead create a new rule and say colorful. Right? So don't, or actually let's make this more unambiguous and call this switch color. So now I create the class switch color, and can now basically say, okay, I can have an animation now. Now, this should be sufficient nowadays for most browsers. The problem that we have a little bit is, in theory, there are different ways of doing that. There's WebKit and mods, and I mean, this in theory is a little bit more complicated, and I would really suggest you to look it up. But for now, we're basically going to simplify this down, right? So, and then we're basically going to say, okay, what's going to be the, I can basically give a time, and then just say colorful. And what happens now is that you can see that it starts switching color. And, oh, and basically need to also do this, let's say infinite, right? Okay. So now basically starts going through these steps here. So this is very simple. It's just, like, okay, 2 steps. So from color blue to color green, and the process takes 2 seconds to go through it. And this is basically the function name if you want so. And infinite basically means it's going to loop and do this over and over again. And so again, this is a little bit of a more complex topic of how to trigger those. So depending on what you need, look it up. I just want to introduce you to how this basically works. So you can see that this at defines particular things. In that case, this is the name. There's something else I want to talk about, and that is basically the possibility to set up variables. So variables is something that I'm still not sure if I should even talk about it, because actually we're going to then go into SASS and less. Yeah, you know what? Let's forget about variables. Let's talk about preprocessors. So what you've probably read a lot is stuff like SASS or less. So those are preprocessors that would basically say, okay, we're going to generate this for you, right? So let's go back to a project and basically try this out now. And I'm just going to introduce you to it and say, okay, we have another style sheet that we call test, and it's going to be a SASS file. I'm going to make my life simple now and create a file watcher. So in reality, this is something that you need to run and install. And I'm going to basically automate this a little bit here and say, okay, oh, see, I don't have it. That is wonderful. I would literally have to install it. Okay, forget about it right now. Let's make this pretty simple and say, okay, so you have basically something that would then compile into CSS and would generate that for you. So depending on, and you can basically, I think it's sasslang, if I'm not mistaken. Sasslang, yep. You can basically look up how the general logic works. Actually, let's walk through it. Why not? So you can basically see, okay, where does it, okay, this is all of that. No, we don't need that. Here we go. So if there's a Node version, for example, we're going to use that one for now, and simply install that. npm IG SASS, and it's in the standalone application. I hope that ships with the CLI. We'll see that in a second. And oops. Oh, right. This is actually my thing that I really need to get solved here. What? Okay. Looks better. Okay. Okay, sorry about that. So let's try this out. So the first thing that we're going to do, so now I basically said, okay, instead of this, I'm going to, where are we? I'm going to include our test CSS. So as you can see, the test CSS does not exist. See that? So what we do instead is we, for example, going to say something like, okay, there is green. And green is we do this basically. How do we do this? So we say 0. Oops. Oh, this does it automatically. Wonderful. Red, green. So this would be 255. And oops, 250. And then we're gonna say, okay, it's a dash of RGB. Okay. So as you can see now, and my ID hides it a little bit, this basically created nothing. Wonderful, because we're not applying it anywhere. So what we want to do is to then say, okay, so I don't know, let's say topics is, and then we'd simply apply and say color green. Okay, let's run this for a second. Okay, let's open this. Okay, now as you can see, now this was basically used. This is how my actual CSS looks like now. And as you can also see, the possibilities I have is that I can now basically define global variables and basically apply this to a couple of rules. So in the example that we had, if I say, okay, this is for example something like 400, I could now basically have those values and you know, create something like, okay, whoops, mobile width, or tablet, right, something like this, and then say, okay, this starts from 450 pixels or whatever. And oh, I don't need that in SASS. And that's basically how I could basically start, you know, creating variables and then apply them and reuse them, and they would be rendered accordingly. And that is basically, it goes a lot more complicated. You have the mixins that you can use and so on. So let me actually quickly see what's the interesting stuff about this, where my mixins here operates, building modules, breaking changes. Mix in and include. Oh yeah, include is also super interesting. So here basically you define functions that you can do, you know, where you can, you know, also pass variables in and so on. And include is also very interesting. Or import is also very interesting. So you can basically cross-reference different files and have that in a very clean structure, and then you basically render this accordingly. Now, I'm using the PHP Storm file watcher now, so this is done for me, what's happening here. What's probably interesting to know is if you're not using an IDE that is capable of doing that, then you would basically have to, and we have this version probably, you probably have to, you know, write the logic accordingly and say, please take that file and give it to this output. There are also automations on Node with gulp and so on where you can integrate that. So there's a lot of possibilities to actually do that. Again, for me, it's pretty simple. It just happens on save. Back to our logic here. So less works basically the same. I mean, the syntax is differently. It has a little bit of different capabilities, but at the end of the day, it's actually the same. And if you look into the frameworks that we're basically going to conclude this video with now, you will see that under the hood, they're using that to generate all that CSS, right? So let's look at actually the Bootstrap. Probably one of the most common ones is Twitter Bootstrap, and if we actually look at how that works, you can basically see, okay, where's my download? Maybe please don't just download. Okay, source files. Are you guys not on? Yeah, GitHub, got it. Cancel. Okay, so this is basically the repository of Bootstrap, and you can basically see what is happening under the hood with this. And so here we have the SCSS. And you can see, let's look at that one, for example. So here see that full of those variables and so on, and they just basically at the end render together. And you can basically change values. That's where if you basically do your theming, where you can basically influence this. Here you can see the how that's supposed to work with SASS and so on, and you can basically start working on adapting what you need, change particular things and so on, and well, modify or customize if you want, so your output of a particular framework. They basically all work like that. I can't think of any exception. So okay, but what is a CSS framework? Again, Bootstrap is one of the most used ones. It's not a pure CSS framework. That's probably why. So there's a lot of JavaScript included here. But in theory, what you do is, and we can basically look at this. So you use a style sheet, right? That you can, in that case, it's an external one, but it doesn't matter. It could be on your device. You can see exactly that's the same thing that we did, right? So here we're including our own, but you can actually include it from a different source. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to ignore the JS for now. And then you can basically see how their logic works. So let's, for example, look at something logical like grid. Yeah, their grid system. So here you can basically see this is how they design, how things are next to each other and how they behave. That's a Flexbox Grid. So if like how that, if let's actually look at it like this. If it basically gets small enough, yep, then all of a sudden it starts stacking and so on. So this is all defined by classes, and if you're using that, then the only thing you're really learning is what kind of classes do I have to apply. So here you can see, okay, there's a container, then there's a row, so this will constitute a row in Bootstrap, and then you have a column, and this is the size attribute of small in that case, and another column and another column. So this will basically generate this row. And this looks a little bit different depending on the framework, but the principle always applies, right? I would recommend, especially when you're beginning, to use something that is a CSS only framework, so that doesn't contain any kind of JavaScript. And one of those would, for example, be Bulma.io. Yep. So that's a pure CSS framework. Where's my documentation? Let's look at the grid here, so you can basically see that. Okay, basics. Let's see. So you can see it's relatively similar, right? You say columns, and then the column. So that's basically what would be row in Bootstrap, and that would be col in Bootstrap, right? But the principle is the same, and The big difference is that everything works with CSS only, so there's no JavaScript that would do it. So you can always actually really look up the rules, right? So if I want to understand what's happening here, I can really go in there and say, okay, so what is applied to this column, right? How does this even work? So you can see the padding, the margin, everything. You can look at all of the calculated styles that were applied here. And you can here see how it looks like. See, here, I've got padding, not margin, good to know. So that is basically how things are used. And if you look at something like, I don't know, probably modifiers. The problem is that like how they structure their documentation, that's also like very, very custom. So that's why people say I learned a CSS framework, because getting along in the documentation is something that is always a little bit of a challenge, because they all have different ways of organizing all their components and so on. So for example, what constitutes an element and what constitutes a component, well, that is their definition of like a different CSS framework would categorize maybe differently. So let's do color helpers, for example. And you can basically see this is very close to the English language also, right? Has text info, so that would basically apply this color, right, to your text in that case, or whatever contains text. And of course, those are also, again, this is all basically based on variables, so you will always have the possibility, maybe you can see that somewhere. There should be, where do I do this? Alignment colors. Probably in here, huh? This is a list of all the variables. Okay. So here I can basically start defining, okay, how does this work, right? And what are the variables that I can personally set in order to change this particular behavior, where when I say blue, I want to have a different kind of blue, and so on. And then render it accordingly with, well, I guess SASS. Yeah, with SASS. And that's basically how those things work. Again, I would recommend a CSS only framework for the beginning. So Bulma is relatively nice. You can look at a couple of Bulma templates. So we can basically see free Bulma templates, sure, why not? Basically see, what kind of look and feel that people generate with it. Right, let's look at that one, for example. It ironically isn't the link. Okay, well, actually I don't like it, but it doesn't matter. You can basically see how this is done. And this is all made with Bulma, so you can basically, just work with that accordingly. Also, if you see stuff like that, that's all made with Bulma, right? And so this is just basically this applied and then designed. What makes a lot of sense, especially for beginners, it's a little bit verbose, but nonetheless, I start loving it, even though it was a little bit overwhelmed at the beginning, is Tailwind. So Tailwind CSS is a utility-first CSS framework. What they mean by that is that you almost write inline style in order to find the look and feel until you like it. Here you can basically see that. So here I apply height 16, width 16, rounded full, and MX, so margin, and then on the x-axis auto. So all of that is basically done. Everything that we've written isn't just this line of code or in this attribute value. And to see how it changes here, and it's basically how that works. And also very nice. I mean, let's look at a couple of components so we can basically see the look and feel. Let's maybe see how the buttons look like. Here you can see that nicely. So this button is not how like a dot button would look like. That's very different from the Bootstrap system. So let's see, just as a comparison, how those systems work. Yeah, let's do buttons. So basically how this button looks like, right, is defined with a class button. See that? BTN. With the class BTN, that would basically define, okay, this is a button. And then I can add, so button primary or BTN primary, that makes it basically this kind of color, right? So this bluish background with the white color applies that kind of style. And then I can apply, different well, sizes and stuff like that. Let's actually look at, do we have anything? Yeah, here, right? And then I say, okay, button outline primary. And then it has, switches a bit of things here, different sizes and so on. But the basic gist of how that looks like, that's just a Bootstrap style. So I can change the colors, of course, and I could, change, for example, okay, how round is it? What's the hover effect and so on? I could, but then I'm already like deep in the core of Bootstrap, and basically kind of defeats the purpose of using a CSS framework when you basically say, okay, you need to be very clean and careful that it stays possible to update and so on. So Tailwind has a very different approach. It basically, there is no such thing as a standard button. So this button, for example, is generated and says exactly what it does. So here, see, this is the button that we're looking at. And okay, so it says background blue 500. And that's the shade 500. Look into it, what that means. And then on hover, it gets a darker blue. The text is white. The font is bold. There's a padding Y, right? So up and down of 2, and on the sides of 4, right? And then unfortunately we don't see that. And then rounded. So it would basically have these kind of rounded things. Actually, let me see if can I influence this? No, this would be nice if I could do live. But this basically generates this kind of button. So the idea is that you play around with exactly what you want directly, inline if you want so. And if you're happy with that, you can then basically start to apply that. So what we see here is, for example, okay, so they created now the button blue. How did they do that? Well, because in style, they basically said, okay, so here in the button, apply what we've, the stuff that we've written here. So font bold, this and this and this. So just the colors are gone. And in the button blue, they would then basically say, okay, so this happens when the background basically, or when it's blue, this is the kind of color I want to be applied. And this is when I hover. See how it gets darker, what needs to be applied. So I basically just play around with that, and then if I'm happy and say like this is how my button is going to look like, then I simply in very little amount of code, pack that together if you want. So into, okay, this is now basically just 2 classes, right? 3 definitions, but 2 classes, right? The button blue. So that's how they basically recreated that in a very short amount of time. So you can basically, depending on your project, this could look completely different for you. As you can see here, this is the rounded full, I suppose, is the only difference here. Yeah, so this is rounded full, then it looks different. You can do this outlined, and you can basically see, okay, the background is transparent. This is actually written. It doesn't say outlined, like in Bootstrap. See that? So we define what that means. It means, okay, there's a background transparent. However, if I hover it, it's full. See that? Text is blue 700, what is right now, and then font semi-bold, okay, and then on hover, text turns white. See that? So it tells you exactly what you want to do, and you can basically just write that in CSS. It's very cool to basically work with. I don't know what this is. That's 3D. It's a border. Okay. They do that with a border. A little bit boring, but sure. So you basically almost design in your HTML, which basically means you can see the result immediately, which is pretty awesome. Anyway, what is another thing is, so we talked about Bootstrap, we talked about Bulma, we talked about Tailwind, and then there are naturally frameworks that are designed to work together with a particular JavaScript framework. Just for example, say material.angular.io. I hope I'm right. Okay. So this is something that at the beginning is a little bit overwhelming. But if you, for example, here work with Angular, then that makes a lot of sense because you can basically hook into, and there's actually functionality already provided. So not only does it have a look and feel, I mean, this is how, so-called material design input looks like. And actually, let's look at how that would be written. So here's what we're seeing, right? So this input, right, that we're seeing here is surrounded by this material form field, right? Example full. I don't think we need that. That's probably this for here, right? Yeah. So this is just for this page. Ignore that. This custom element alone would basically do the trick that this is rendered correctly. And this is basically based on Angular. So this would not, basically most of this functionality is done with JavaScript. A lot of how it behaves. So if you see like what happens here, for example, like that's not pure CSS. Not because of the limitations of CSS, which there are plentiful. So sometimes you have to use JavaScript to make something happen. Actually, with simple things like dropdowns, it already starts normally. But actually, because you later on, I mean, again, we will not go into this right now, but we will hook into certain things of values and basically say, okay, if a username is already taken and you type it in, we're going to change this whole thing to red. So we're going to react and hook in functionality on those things, or let's maybe see an autocomplete, then it's easiest to understand that there needs to be more behind it. Simple autocomplete, so I start doing, this is actually too simple. Don't I have custom input element, detecting autocomplete, option groups. Okay, this is actually a little bit too boring, to be honest with you. I was hoping for something. It's just options. Maybe search or something like that. I'm not familiar. I would have to go in and actually find something that makes a little bit more sense. But the pure fact that there's something like an API should already tell you that there's more that you can basically do with this, even though this actually is just pure CSS here. I just saw that and trigger. So you just provide all of that. No, those are all input references. Okay. Right. So I can here close panel. This is something that I can call from outside. Right. So this is important to understand that, okay, this is not just style. So I could, for example, now have a button here. I mean, it would close anyway, but that would, for example, open this, right, and close it again. I can trigger this functionality from outside with JavaScript and basically hook into the values and all kinds of things. And that is why those kind of frameworks are cool, but I would highly recommend to jump into that when you're, for example, working with Angular anyway, and then say like, yes, I like the material design components that they provide, and I want to work with that. And that is true for a couple of frameworks that are very, very coupled. So what you want to look for is basically CSS only frameworks, or frameworks that would be very, very self-comprised. So with Bootstrap, what you see here, actually when we click on Get Started, you will see immediately the problem. So we ignored this JS portion here. So you can see that, okay, you already need jQuery. It's necessary to basically include this. And I don't even know what that is, to be honest with you, but apparently you also need this before you actually use the actual Bootstrap CSS. So this relies on a particular framework, and without that, basically this will simply not work, which basically is a shame. So when we're talking about stuff like modals, for example, if I find that, yeah, sure, why not? Let me see if we have an example here. Really? Oh, here. Right, that kind of stuff. So this kind of functionality, that's not style now. This actually happened, right? Some functionality was applied. So I can close this now. which basically means that whatever this does, this closes it, and this closes it, and this closes it not. Okay, right? So this basically works, and this is basically the markup that you have. So this does not show. See that? We don't see it now. So the JavaScript already hit it, and then I have to click something or trigger it something, in that case with this data toggle here, data target, probably example modal. Yeah, that's our example modal. And that's how this whole thing would work. So I need a lot of logic that's already written for you. So you still only write the HTML, but you already need JavaScript included or to execute that, which means you will not be able to understand or influence how this works without a profound knowledge of JavaScript. And even then, you don't want to make changes to something like Bootstrap that you're using, because later on, if Bootstrap comes out with a new version, you can't just simply apply that. You got to be very careful with that kind of stuff. Yeah, I think that basically concludes it. I might have a small update on that. A friend of mine currently creates his own CSS framework, and I will basically post that in this little, down in the description as soon as I basically see some results that I think are worth sharing. Thank you so much, and I know this is kind of a rough start as always, but I hope that you have gathered enough so you can start playing around and have some fun. Thank you very much.